You made sure the battery pack was fresh, right? I asked to Codfish's conclusion as he pulled the metal brick from the bag. Largemouth is one of the junior guys on my unit and thus is being given a simple yet important task to maintain. And then it grabbed me around the neck. Sliding over several meters, he got to a clear gap between the trees, setting up his MG3's bipod and readying for a fresh bout. Codfish slid over, checking his vest, saying, "Some thermite will burn right through there, but we'll need to place it manually. Our position is no longer a secret." Anglerfish muttered, gazing at the fog. It didn't feel like it was hollow, in fact. "You should be thanking me. Something wasn't right." The more we fussed over the radio, the more it seemed the darkness around us was closing in, smothering us. He still continued to scream, even as his body was being picked apart. That wasn't good. I could feel my life fading as it squeezed, a vice grip causing me to gasp and sputter, a wretched smile gracing its face. My other hand, unable to reach for anything, fought to keep its other mid from my neck. "Destroy it and her ties to the side will be severed." Codfish opened it up and was astounded. Once again he nodded, "Very likely." "Why?" Codfish asked the million-krone question. This allowed us to safely travel down the river. Nothing but shadows and silence greeted us as you could hear the sounds of our boots treading through the mud and rock from every corner of this place. Once the children went underneath, they've never felt pain again. Aid-aided allies, ones that weren't taken by the mist. I realized then that Anglerfish had led us exactly to where we needed to go. Whether it's moisture or something else, they're going to have to formulate a conclusion as to what's going on, and if they can, neutralize it. The other shot straight for my throat, silencing my yells as I was pulled to a sitting position, forced to watch as I came face to face with Nixie. I still didn't get a full proper look. My eyes were stinging with both my sweat and blood. Dirt and now mud smeared the lenses of my night vision goggles, but those eyes from beneath the layer of matted hair and wretched twigs that layered the top of her head, they glowed like spotlights. Unblinking and unflinching, hypnotizing me, ordering me to stand down and allow myself to be dragged in. Danish Sockum is seen as one of NATO's finest units, and because of that, it's not uncommon for us to be messaged 3ed upon even as we were back home. They were once my countrymen and now my enemy. I looked out and gazed at the chief, who even now I felt was looking directly at me. "You're gonna betray everybody you swear to protect, the woman, the children?" I asked. "Dang that freaking radio head. Click. Any of a thing. The kind of slumber I experienced is strange. Are they all right?" I nodded. The cultists had reformed with what was left of their thralls, forming a circle as they descended upon him through a gap in the formation. We made eye contact. His breathing was shaky and uncertain, but he nodded to me. It wasn't a request, there was nothing that I could do to stop him. It was an honor. I nodded in return. He had been by my side for 2 continents and several dozen missions. He deserved all of the respect in that moment. It was left side first, right on my bad arm. "We have to try." I jest, if it weren't for him I wouldn't be here typing this out. I slid in the driver's head, flipping up my night vision. I had to force my eyes shut. "You got a shot?" I asked Angler. And above all, I felt watched. Even then, some still tried to crawl as pieces of themselves hung off by a tendon and flesh. Their commandeered bodies now had only one goal. The ground was at an incline just slightly for maybe 50 meters or so for a clearing, and then a single line of trees that was unmistakably a slope or a cliff. The fog got more and more dispersed, only seeming to come back into its fullest a good ways away. He started, checking the chamber of his rifle. Largemouth looked at me as I peeked over the wall. I knew them well, the last remnants of true paganism in the world that hadn't been burned away by inquisitions or crusades. They made up lines, shapes, and phrases that I will never know what they said. "You'd need to kill Nixie." Leister quickly shoved what was left of the door closed as another officer barred it. That was until he muttered under his breath in pain, dropping the hand mic. "What the hell?" "It shocked me," he said, favoring his hand. "Some tales describe her as malicious, a being that lurks the swamps, hoping to kidnap. Others describe her as curious." Codfish covered us from behind as Angler took aim at the church with large mouth. I kept my back to the wall, then looked over at my gunner. I looked back to the priest. And we would not allow that. Largemouth to my right, anglerfish to my left, as he always seemed to help pick the best route to maneuver on. Codfish further back to keep our comms out of direct fire. "All right, where to?" "Northeast, on to." "Northeast," anglerfish said, quiet and scanning the direction that they came from. I wasn't sure if it was the wind or something else, but they came from that direction. And then, from the pond, Spin the arms black and smooth like obsidian emerged from the area above his head. Front of the church, wood line, from our 10 to our 3. Codfish has been moved to another team and I don't even know if they'll ever let me lead an element again. I hope it was worth it. In fact, the mist seemed to get thinner the closer that we got to it. The creature yelled. Codfish and largemouth gazing around as anglerfish stared deadlocked onto my face. A set of 4 tubes allowing for a wide view that made the dark seem as clear as day, albeit with a white and blue hue. The forest around us was much more afraid of it than it was a team of Danish Special Forces operatives. We had to tread carefully. And then there's me, Kraken. I looked back at large fish, who had pushed our enemies a considerable distance back, and then his belt went dry and he saw this and then turned to join us and stopped. I wanted to yell, I wanted to rush to his aid to save my machine gunner, but I couldn't. Not just any, the priest said. He paused for a moment, locking eyes with all 3 of us before he took a shaky inhale and explained. My team was bathed in silence. Enough of your bullheadedness, he muttered. We have to. This wasn't going to be easy. Grabbing me by one of my legs, I was dragged down to the pool of water, as a female came from the direction of my head and drove a small dagger into my left shoulder. Leicester? Largemouth had asked. Thankfully, whoever made that perfect Austrian handgun decided to not pull the safety that mattered. There were at least a dozen, some carried axes dried with red iron, others knives or glaives. He quickly checked my wound, popping open the IFAK mounted to my belt as he scanned around and shouted into his headset. This is Element Romeo, any station on net, radio check. This felt a lot more like a deployment than it did home turf. I remember the area ahead so vividly. He looked at me with weak eyes. The military wanted to get involved at first, however, the government wanted the locals to handle it, leave it to them to let things go from bad to worse. Investigators were sent in and immediately all contact was lost with them. And taking in nature, you realize something. I tried to lead a search party out there. My holster was trapped beneath one of its legs, so instead I grabbed it by whatever jacket it was wearing and pulled it down towards me, headbutting it. It seemed to stagger it enough that I could get it rolled off, but before long the cultists had descended on me again. And then, nothing. With my right hand, I grabbed the one on my right side by the neck, causing him to panic. Yes. We have no need for our flesh or the outside world. What did Nixie offer you? More happiness than we had ever known. Watch and shoot. The last thing I remembered when I looked back was Largemouth staring defiantly into that damn beast's eyes as he let the spoonless grenades drop to the ground. There was no way they could have entered, we had every entrance covered. A head rose up from the pond, following the arms as they peeled away flesh and muscle. We were under attack once, and I will probably be soon again. I probably would have been shivering from the wet cold of the air had adrenaline not been pumping through every vein in my body. The low visibility of the fog and darkness left 1,000 avenues of ambush and approach that needed to be covered, for a million possibilities. Element Romeo, this is Maine, requesting status. Run, now, and leave everybody in there to be slaughtered. You can feel it too, as can all of them. Save your breath, officer. Quickly move to secure the storm door. I looked around, locating Leicester. Or at least that's what I kept telling myself. I remember hitting the release and letting the metal mag drop to the floor as I shoved a new one in and hit the bolt release, replenishing my weapon. Everybody had one. I ordered the priest to get everybody to the safest position they could, which is he then messaged 3Ed out. To the cellar, hurry. An anxious yet surprisingly orderly stampede filled the church as the dozens inside hurried underground. This is out of our depth, Codfish argued. Yet his words came out smoothly. It was only by the grace of God that my backplate and soft armor held up, just barely. However, I didn't have the luxury of stopping for long. My planning was broken up when I heard yells and shouts come from our 9 o'clock, drawing closer. Some were in between complacent and in a trance, yet he led us, cognizant enough to make course corrections despite the fact that he seemed to be working off of instinct. In Afghanistan, he helped us track an HVT through rugged mountainous terrain, choosing the best path to maneuver on the fly that saved hours from an already long journey. Almost as if the light itself wasn't illuminating them but some of their force. The hair on her head was spindly, looking like a bundle of twigs and fur that had sat in the marsh for several thousands of years. Her face was almost entirely obscured except for a set of eyes. He was fighting back the urge to enter into shock. Enough to cause a small watering of my eyes but not much else. While I initially thought it was the fog, the similarities to our radio sent a chill up my spine. What do you think? Caught my spine. And so, the frogmen were messaged 3Ed upon. Mostly. We couldn't even see what was taking our guys out there before it was just me and a handful of others. He said. That we knew of. As we quietly breached and entered, we found no one. Just a layer of dust and water over everything. Just want this to be over with, he said, shaking his head with a huff that seemed to spur him out of it. How are we supposed to kill her anyways? She's some sort of witch, Largemouth asked. And I could tell my men were feeling it. Codfish focused far too much on certain windows and shadows, causing him to quickly yet messily snap to a few points. He looked down. I stood up, gazing at everyone including the priest who licked the blood on his hands and then mournfully to me. Is something wrong? I asked, finally addressing him. And then, others I didn't know of at the time but after some research, I found out to be Wiccan, iconography, moon, stars, druid swirls, and eyes. Asking me to return to that swamp, to her. I couldn't bring myself to. Thinking back now, it felt real. Regardless, we tumbled down the rest of the slope in a mess. I looked at my team, see Codfish and Largemouth nodding. Contact. Largemouth yelled, seeing the assailant before I had. A gunshot. It had arrived. The fog was stifling, attempting to envelop us at any point had we stopped to do anything. My senses were going haywire between being blinded visually, the silence allowing any twigged snap or splash to catch my attention, the cold air mixed with the periodic steps we took through the bog, freezing our legs and shocking our system. We've been sent in as the forward element to figure out what happened here. The front and rear left side doors were opened. This wasn't ideal, and we were only a couple of steps from Fubar finally, through the milky gray wall, I finally caught sight of what we had been waiting for, the rooftop corner of a one-floor house and part of a wooden fence poking through the fog like bones to be uncovered. The air was still, too still considering the port that we had departed from was as windy as could be. I quickly motioned for my team to halt. We would need to successfully get the jump on them if we were going to make it out of this. Old-style garb not found in this land, and no matter how far you look back, dressed in grays, whites, and blacks. I have and still have never heard anything like what he was saying. My CO message threes me his hammer, the one he sends in to take an objective that is absolutely essential. Okay, now that you've got the context of my team, let's get down to it. Codfish tried again, keying into the hand mic, however, and shook his head. We were in no position to make it, not since we had stepped off those docks. We were the best of the best, and I was leading us to our demise. One was a man and the other a police officer. And then a smile crossed his face as he said, "Oh, don't worry." Once again, my instinct as a leader took over. He was leaning in on the passengers. However, Codfish has always been able to make do, which is why I fought so hard to keep him on my team. The fog complicated things to the point where an LZ for a bird couldn't be planned. Not just because of any possible offer in the area of operation, but well, the mist wouldn't allow the pilots to see any trees or flora, which could turn a quick landing into a mass casualty scenario, so we did things the Frogman way from the water or rigid hull inflatable boat or a Zodiac. They're the inflatable boats seen in every action movie. They're cumbersome, they get shaken and thrown by any small waves, and they're all around just a damn pain to use. However, there is somewhat still the most reliable source of redundant amphibious transportation that we had second to swimming. I don't know if she planned it, that witch. A bit fuzzy, but I can read you. He slipped back against the tree, gun falling awkwardly on top of him. We still need to figure out what's happened. Codfish hadn't dropped into the river as well. His answer was immediate, and the artificial attempted emotion behind his words shook something deep down inside of me. His voice echoed across the chapel as he continued. Brows furrowed as enraged glowing eyes stared down at me as it grabbed me by my helmet and tried pulling it off. Our low-toned discussion was cut off by a loud bang that shook the silence of the village. From the doors, the handgun, a revolver, was tossed out to the steps. As a police officer carefully stepped out, arms raised. Heat had returned to Europe, so the winter's cold wasn't in effect. A wounded lion was still a lion. She won't. Roger, Element Romeo. Them. Codfish snapped back in a harsh whisper. We need to move. Doors remained unlocked and opened. Condition. However, the Royal Navy believed it was easier than attempting to create a false scenario of some of its best operatives dying overseas. The site was gone, almost completely wiped off the earth, and the bodies in the disappeared couldn't be found, despite Marines and Home Guard performing several searches of the entire grid square. Any station on this net? I am requesting a radio check. Largemouth laughed and shook his head. We've got movement. The priest departed, wishing us well. God be with you, son. No signs of life from where we were. This was an active river, there should be some sort of current. The eye of the storm. Take it. What did you see? A handgun from between the doors cracked off a shot. The back window was smashed from a circular impact mark. As the left one attempted to adjust, I instead leaned back, allowing my knee to connect to his strange deer head. A violent crowd control as he was forced to back up. You're about to find out. The brute had done a number on him, tearing open his stomach. It was a mess of organ, flesh, and blood. There is always some sort of sound. I stepped over each of the bodies. I lead a 4-man team element under a larger squadron. I looked around, locating Leicester. But still I waited, wondering where the first strike was going to come from. I still think back to that long walk we made through the marsh, one final trek to end this. Repeat that, what? Codfish asked. You good? I asked, locking eyes with his tubes as he slowly turned, staring at me. Yeah, he said in a low tone. Our radios are down, so for now, it's only us. We didn't know what was coming next, but I don't think anything could have prepared any of us for it. Despite the paranoia, he had been shoulder to shoulder with us, so I was going to trust him, no matter what. Largemouth cried out in rage. The last thing I heard was Largemouth angrily cursing beneath his breath as he let loose. 3 shots tear through the palms, hit one in the head and drops them instantly. I'm Officer Leicester, he said, confirming his affiliation. To no avail. If we leave, it'll be on foot and we'll be ambushed. We know the direction they came from, and right now, we are the only ones that can stop it. God. The last thing that he needed to do was dump all of his oxygen, blaming himself. Codfish gave a shaky, unsure exhale as he nodded. We got low to the ground, holding my rifle by its front sling swivel. They nodded, Codfish chiming in. This continued for house after house as we tried our best to clear through, investigate, and came up with nothing. Prior allegiances didn't matter now. He was right. In another time, another life, it had acted as a human wave reducer. And now, our best chance at survival is it tore through the wood with a thunderous burst. Mothers trying to desperately calm their children. The thing that was the police chief then spoke. But I have heard every single form of linguistic while traveling the world. English, Spanish, Norwegian, Danish, Swedish, Finnish, Polish, Arabic, Cantonese, everything. The worst part was all of them wore masks. And then, a yell came from behind as the priest appeared from the dark and raised an axe in the air and came down onto its back. No response. I tried scrambling to my feet, but a pain from deep within my chest shocked me enough to be stuck at the knee. No, nothing. It then became a slow crawl through the marsh, our Zodiac turning left and right through the weaving river as the IR lasers mounted to our weapons, scanned across the edges of the fog, ready in case anything were to test us. We had reached the center point of the village, a large stone church with a main tower that jetted up at least 20 meters high, piercing the fog. We're Royal Army. Despair of the past several weeks was clashing with the relief of us being here. A child, one of those that the former police chief had mentioned, stared back up at him with glowing eyes. It backed off and he staggered forward. In fact, the entire inside of the vehicle was dripping wet. The sound barrier of the mist battling large mouse controlled bursts of violence as groups of them were cut down at a time, a pile of brass building up around them. Every single face had a story that ended. This seems to be the former. My blood slowed as I felt the cold become uncomfortable. I remember another violent coughing fit trying to get my bearings as Anglerfish must have noticed that I was still alive. He aimed his pistol at me, and I stared down at the barrel prepared to meet my fate at the hands of one of my own team now turned unwilling traitor. It's in perfect condition, he muttered looking up at me. I crawled forward, the rest of my team following close behind. The goal was to keep as low of a silhouette as possible. However, when I got the text for my team to spin up, I was surprised to learn that we weren't going to any active theater, but something right here at home. In total, our complete element was around 12 servicemen, and all of us were ushered into one of the briefing rooms per usual. Leicester's eyes quickly locked with mine. Those vile monsters. The German belt-fed machine gun is referred to as the buzzsaw for good reason. Fishing out the hand mic, he prepared to update our unit on our progress. Our rifles were raised, scanning whatever we could, preparing for another wave of our people that had been paranormally conscripted to rush us with anything from knives to their bare hands. And then the people. And it was inside a waterproof bag. "It's all right," Largemouth said, setting the MG3 down on its biped as he knelt. From what I can only guess was him attempting to alleviate the back pain that every machine gunner felt. "I'll both of you shut it," I barked, silencing their feud. His MG3 hit the ground as his arms shook. "Breach the church and commit unspeakable horrors to those inside." A good thing, too, because as we drew near, the radios crackled and I heard Largemouth say, "I'm hearing voices to our 12 and 10. "So, somebody on our side," I said, a half-question to which the priest had nodded at. First the men, and then the police when they tried to investigate. Before long, people started to take refuge. Not long after, a burst of machine gun fire shook the forest as Largemouth staggered to his feet. I wanted to believe it was hysteria, the priest and officer attempting to rationalize it, but that didn't explain the fog, the moss, the feeling of being watched, the disappearances. Is it bad? He asked, and my silence was his answer. He didn't give them a chance to request shit. What did I think? I knew that whatever cut off our ability to contact our support did so to the local forces. A sort of one-piece cloak, yet segmented into proper sleeves and pant legs. It wasn't uncommon for moisture in a fog this thick to leak through bags, fatigues, rocks. But these radios were, under reasonable circumstances, able to hold up against being rained on for a considerable amount of time. Just come outside. Anglerfish and I quickly at our sights tranned in the door with largemouth as codfish kept watch elsewhere. How were we supposed to kill her? I mean, could we even? The word knock was as ingrained in Scandinavian mythology as folklore that I knew growing up. Could we even do anything? I looked away and then back to Leicester. From there, we took up positions. I then noticed that the gunfire had stopped. Codfish asked, packing away his radio. It sounded incomprehensible, like it had syllables, and it was definitely a language. Maybe our command believed our usual tactics of night infiltration would give us an advantage prior missions did not. Out of the nearly 600 applicants that we get every year, less than a dozen actually make it in, and fewer still are able to give up everything to make this a long-term career. I am one of the few, and I have been with the teams for several years and have found great pride in my service. Above all, I have been committed to every aspect of my job, and that includes the vow of silence we take. That is, until today I have waged war against men from every corner of the world, state-sanctioned and true believer, terrorist, yet the fight that shook me to my core wasn't on some far-off battlefield, but right here at home. For the sake of those that I've served with and lost, code names will be used to obscure their identity and mine. With his hold on my throat loosened, oxygen returned. My hand quickly went to my holster, drawing my Glalik from its Kydex prison, as I shoved it well into its mouth, firing off shot after shot. We should have done something then and there, but I knew that we needed more info. She's giving us all we need. We stop her. It could have been slurred gibberish, but the point was clear. I patted my marksman on the shoulder, thanking him in a breathless whisper to minimize the amount of noise. Before us laid a large clearing in the middle of a circular ditch or crater. I continued, help this thing, allow all of this. I messily raised my -18 Malawian kwaches, firing off several rounds into its legs that only seemed to slow it. He looked back to me. The silence of the church broke out into relieved sighs and mutters as we entered. I thought it was only him keeping watch. I've been recovering ever since then, and even now, months later, those piercing yellow eyes still haunt me. Taking cover, his large mouth placed his gun on the top face of it. Precedence is urgent. Denmark's roads are decent, but this far out, it left a considerable amount of dirt, cracks and wear to be seen. Anglerfish covered our 3 o'clock, and Codfish knelt down and heaved his radio pack up off his back. Largemouth staggered forward, positioning himself in front of me as he hip-fired his MG3. Element lead to main, radio check over. And yet, whatever was in these woods commanded its respect. He said, picking up and preparing to move. The beige square battery along with the entire inside of the radio was layered with moss. He had to fight to pry the battery out, showing that it was caked in it, along with a ton of condensation. It was consuming and deteriorating. I gave us the early advantage. We frogmen spend a lot of time in the field, figuratively and literally soaking in nature's worst yet most pure conditions. I've spent a lot of time up to my mouth in swamp water and mud. Anglerfish is an essential part of that, as he utilizes a powerful scope to help detail the path and its terrain around it, along with being able to reach out and touch anyone we need. Remove the pipeline for becoming a Danish sniper is one of the most grueling and humbling courses you could take, and it requires a fair amount of calculation, humility, and control. He is all of these things on the other side of the spectrum. We have my gunner, Largemouth. Beings like her are drawn to our side by being tied to an object. Anglerfish and Largemouth took the right side. It was burning a hole through my soul. When do what? Walk 10 kilometers only to be ambushed in the open? I argued, Codfish looking at me wanting to argue. A lot of eyes. Codfish, as I'll message 3 him, is our commsman, skilled in being able to obtain and maintain connection no matter the environment, no matter the equipment. I'll be topside, I said to him. I looked to Leicester, dread filling his eyes as he looked to the floor and then back to me. With darkness fully set in, the naked eye couldn't see anything, and so we took to using our GPNFGS. Quad nods, as some would say. The priest stated, forcing his mouth to utter the word like it was a damn tax. We didn't know what. 1.35, the rounds echoed off, unsuppressed muzzle blast, stripping away skin from the entry as wounds painted the ceiling with its vile insides. As it fell down, my body moved like clockwork. At least I hope they were masks. Deer heads, extremely realistic almost if they had been hollowed out and taxidermied, donned the heads of every single one of the cultists. We all took a knee trying to hug the side of the road for cover as we were in the worst possible position. A cricket, a bird, anything. Nodding with a thumbs up, I returned the gesture. His voice monotone like a puppet being controlled. Codfish shined a red light and it was how he illuminated an area that we needed to see without nods, without giving up our position light, a white light would. Without nods, without giving up our position light, a white light would. And then he surveyed the scene and took off, dragging me with him as both of us raced up and over the slope. I forgot the adrenaline. There is no one else. Leicester then gestured to behind us. I drew my Glock 17, wasting no time as my finger felt purchased on the trigger and aimed it around. Centering around a small village over the course of 3 weeks, all communications went from sporadic to broken to nothing. He had grabbed me by my plate carrier's carry handle and was dragging me out of the puddle and onto the slope. I was tackled to the ground by one of the disappeared straight onto my back. My ribs howled in pain as I found my attacker sitting on top of me. It's taken every ounce of effort that I've got, but I've staved it off, for now. I don't know what comes next, but this isn't the end. I signaled for the rest of the team to collapse in. Codfish and Largemouth quickly formed up, all of us trying to keep quiet. After a few seconds of running, we dropped to the ground. The explosion of the grenades shook the earth and sky. I'm getting nothing, he said as he unzipped the bag and revealed the screen and button pad of the radio. To our surprise, it was dead. The retrofitted suppressor that he had mounted onto the front of his gun barely contained the thunderous sound of a long burst of rounds as they tore through the night, yellow and red. As they tore through the night, yellow and red. Codfish stepped forward, smoke exiting his suppressor as he scanned the area, Largemouth recovering as he fought to his feet. My commsman attempted to come to my aid, however the nightmare scenario occurred as our enemies ascended the slope and attacked us. Per our orders, we tried to locate any person and look for any signs of life. Usually, we would be climbing aboard a plane to be sent to a different continent. However, instead, we loaded up into a Lynx, a British dual twin-engined helicopter used for close insert. Too smoothly. Codfish scoffed. I messaged 3Ed out to Anglerfish again, and after a moment, nervousness. Is curious. Codfish hesitated for a second before exiting the vehicle. We kept maneuvering down the road. Largemouth said, sights glued to the front of the church. Situation secured, possibly. Requesting channel for immediate 9 line. My gunner said, dipping his head. What do you think? Codfish asked. But what we did know was that every single soul that lived there was waiting for us to swoop in and help. Get to a good angle, you'll have to be our base of fire, we're gonna need half of that group gone in the first few seconds. I still remember it. A series of hands reaching inside, fingers trying to grasp onto anything. He stepped over the bodies, his eyes unable to gaze at a single one. The cultists seemed unsurprised, and I soon found out why. Those on the outside of the circle parted, allowing 2 of the cultists to enter, one of the officers from the chapel in tow. He was pleading with his eyes for us to stop it, begging me. He raised his hand, I grabbed it, squeezing it as I nodded to him. Take it easy, we've got it from here. His lips formed to say something, but then they stopped. I watched and I felt the life leave him as his hand dropped to the floor. I shut his eyes. The best sign of respect I could show to a man who died defending his home. Usually, we were close enough to not need it, however it helped to minimize the amount of noise it made. We aren't getting any further on water. We need to ditch the raft and head in on foot, I said. Codfish gave up on the engine and took up a watch position from over the channel. Anglerfish asked, what about our exfil? We'll have to take the long way out, I responded, slinging my rifle as I braced myself and dropped feet first into the icy river and dragged the raft ashore. Before she could only manifest through the mist or the water, faint glances, nothing more. If she's here, it means that somebody brought her here, aided her in passing through. Nothing that he could have done could have prevented this. I've served with the unit for almost 10 years now, experienced in 4 official theaters and 2 classified ones. Well, what now? We need to reconnect with command and bring in a battalion, maybe more. An ambush could be waiting around any stump any long. Whatever mist exists seems to be screwing with the comms. Codfish and Largemouth shared a look and then back to me. Even if it was just the 4 of us, it was hope to them. For those of you who are in, say, the American or British militaries, we use these same ANPRC radio series that you guys do, and yes, they do suck. Roll 2 is prepared. The epicenter of this. The mist gave us little to no line of sight, only being able to see around 5 meters ahead of us at the most, and that was it. I had to keep going. No frequency, no information, nothing. The moon was at its highest, and even if not much light was getting through the fog, this was about as much ambient light as we were going to get. We would need every advantage that we could scrape up for what came next. Right then and there, I was measuring our options. A leader amongst them emerged, the police chief. He didn't respond. Over the past several years, the children who lived here said that they saw the current in the nearby bayou break. The flight was short, 30 minutes, but it felt hours. I kept gripping my rifle and -18 Malawian kwaches, a short-barreled rifle imported from the US. Plenty of the corps had started to use the newest IGMCXs, but my quad-railed workhorse had carried me through several tours, so like my team, I trusted it even inside of the helicopter with noise-canceling headphones. The sound of the engine was deafening, shaking my skull and combating the unsure scenario that had gripped my mind. I looked up to see Largemouth locking eyes with me. Grabbing his MG3, he tried to spin around and return fire at Angler, only for our former marksman to draw his pistol and double-tap my gunner in the chest. He was much further away and the caliber was smaller. Only silence answered, and so I tried. "Pick up, we're heading in," I said, rising to my feet. Any military element assembled needs a suitable amount of firepower in case things go wrong, because they can and almost certainly will. Like not a noise, but like something was messing with us. It wasn't that great, but as the red glow shined over the dashboard where our radio should be, only an empty radio mount had remained, covered in moss. He was slumped against the wall that the behemoth had been at. I ordered Anglerfish to take up a good overwatch position, to which he immediately climbed a small set of scaffolds used to help replace and maintain the church's windows, stopping at a circular one above the doors. "I heard you say that you were Army," the priest said. One shot up from my right side, grabbing my gun hand and squeezing it. It didn't hurt, in fact I barely felt it, but all control of my weapon ceased as my weapon fell to the wet ground. This caused Angler to gaze back in surprise, a low mutter of, "What the hell?" Largemouth kept watch as the rest of us moved to inspect the engine. Largemouth took cover behind a large tree and sighted what seemed to be the road into town just to our 9 o'clock. That was until the boot kicked her head, sending her back into whatever hell she crawled from with an audible splash. I regained all feeling as my hands shook, pain shooting through my shoulder as I gazed around. If not, we were to fall back and let the heavy guns roll in. We knew what that meant, and that we had better hope we could find a much cleaner solution while we were on the ground. First thing is, the fog was much clearer than it had been. Silence was all that we had as my eyes clenched shut, sure that we had failed and would be dragged off back to her. I don't know, power. Even with my nods on, I could barely fight to keep my face from being sickened and mournful. It seemed as if the entire wall moved. Enough, I ordered, all three turning. My CO still doesn't believe that it was Nixie, but I know better. I flipped on my nods and what was once a warm and orange room became a dark, blue and white battlefield. At the very least, we still had the elements of surprise, hopefully. We need to keep moving, I muttered. My laser traced the stained glass windows and doors, the slits beside the doors of the stone stairs. It might be a good point to rest at, I said, turning back to Largemouth. And riddled its body, burst after burst. He sat, breaking off as he fought to steady his voice. I saw his face, the color bleeding out as the glow in his eyes faded, and returned back to normal. Those eyes, they were bright gold. Any station? Nothing. Although no words were said, I could feel the unanimous feeling of dread wash over all of us. We have to fall back. Codfish barked again. Yet Anglerfish seemed distant. Scanning with his MG3. The next was the noise. It was a low tone and it felt like a small rumble under the ear and wasn't fully there. A voice caught our attention, the priest. We all had them to communicate throughout our headsets if need be, and they could reach out quite a ways. However, a proper radio unit was needed for sustainable communication. I saw the dark cellar was bathed in the blue ambient light of the outside. Dozens of people were huddled against the walls. My throat ran dry. I awoke a week later at a hospital in Copenhagen. Both were coming through a storm door and locked eyes with me. Their eyes, even now, it haunts me, no pupils, no color, just a milky white. When they saw me, they took off after me 6 shots, 2 to the heads of both. At just a couple of meters the sound of my suppressed barrel bounced off the walls in the room, undoubtedly deafening anybody close. Many grabbed their ears, screaming as the 2 assailants hit the ground. I fired an additional round into the bodies, not wanting a demonic round 2. Leicester! I screamed, looking around. Silence filled the church and then broken up by the muffled cries of the civilians downstairs. After several days, only one transmission came from the town before everything went silent. "This is a ritual site," Codfish muttered over the comms. The priest quickly moved to secure the storm door. "Will do," he said. He switched to the radio and keyed in. "There is no playbook on this. How in the hell were you supposed to negotiate with a thing? A paranormal anomaly?" I barked back with whatever I could think of. It wasn't until we had reached a dry patch in the marsh, leading to a slight incline, that he messaged 3ed us to a halt. Without looking, he pointed back at me and beckoned me to come forth. It's not uncommon. This was during the height of the breakup season after all. Well into the snow, completely thawing and giving way to humidity and rain. No matter what we would face, we would encounter it together. The first person to greet me was my CO, who, although looked exhausted, was relieved that I had returned to the land of the living. The crack and thumb jolted us awake as instincts took over, a sound that we were all too familiar with. "She's going to make us beautiful." Finally, the Royal Navy was set loose and things only got more complicated from there. A hulking thrall turned, eyes glowing milky white as it turned and growled. However, he retorted, it was aimed out when it fired. I heard his words buzz through my headset. Some or more of the disappeared, lining the edges of the slopes, their numbers obviously having dwindled since their assault on the church. Others were, I can only describe them as cultists. The policeman was unarmed, his gear stripped away as he was forcibly dragged out of the stone, kicking and screaming even as cuts and bruises lined his head. I still remember his resistance. "No, we." I yelled at my team to stand their ground as I rushed to the cellar, quickly rounding a small banister and heading down the steps. They glowed, milky white as can be as he stared down at me emotionlessly. I hope wherever that officer is, he can forgive me, and if his family is reading this, I am so sorry. He was held down while two cultists to a limb as his head thrashed around. A horde of disappeared, headed towards Codfish, whose rifle quickly snapped to level and started to fire off shots. It was attempting to dissect through severing information chains. "Stay with me, Kraken." The brick of the church shook, the door swayed slightly, and I saw the tracers and rounds tear the police chief in half where he stood. Voices could be heard, muttering, conversing, whether they were human or not remained to be determined. However, we approached the slope all the same, arriving at the tree lean like the four-eyed demons of NATO that we were, and what laid before us. "Oh, shut your mouth, of course I do. Identify yourself." The police were compromised, Largemouth argued. "We are the best of the best." I peeked through the other slit beside the door, rifle first, my suppressor leading as all our eyes were glued to the wood line across the street that our IR lasers scanned intensely like a light show, and what I saw sent a shiver down my spine. People, the disappeared, those taken, all walked through the marsh and tall grass across from the church. Of course I don't. I knew that something was watching us, as every pore on my back felt like it was on fire from something staring into it. This fog was a screening device. A lead cultist standing at one of the ends, and they began muttering. He made it out better than I had, but it still caught Largemouth by surprise. Largemouth was already set up, poking his MG3 through a gap in the broken wooden door as Codfish took aim through one of these slits beside it. With no entrances on any other side of the church, we prepared to defend the front. No, get the hell off of me. The dry terrain made it a pain, but I knelt beside Anglerfish, and that's when everything felt off. That was until a series of shots were fired off. "You got anything?" He shook his head. For those of you who are well knowledgeable on international special forces, you've probably seen that now famous photo of a fire team aboard a boat with veils obscuring their faces. Holstered my pistol, raised my rifle, and switched to auto. I raised my barrel to fire only for the Goliath to swipe it aside, grabbing me by the front of my plate carrier and throwing me into a stone column. My back hit the wall and my helmet hit the column, shaking my brain as my instinct forced me to rise off the floor as sore as hell. I sat there debating our options as the Zodiac drifted to a halt as the water remained deathly still, leaving us all in a permeable silence. Either way, she is tied to something, an object to ruin a site. I am a member of a special operations force in the Danish Royal Navy, more popularly known as the Danish Frogmen. The trees were so condensed it meant that we had to twist and turn with every single step. A pit in my stomach formed as we all stepped onto our rubber chariot and started off. "You know how to maintain your equipment," Largemouth said, gazing at the site as he went back to scanning the road. One threaded the needle through the side of his headset, through his head, and out the other side in an explosion of gore and plastic. Another grazed the back of his neck below his helmet, and a third through his neck. I didn't give him the chance. It's clear to me now that monsters exist, not metaphorical but literal, real demons that have been around for longer than single-cell organisms have existed, some beyond our comprehension that wears on my mind and deprives me of rest at night. That being said, a sum of humanity is not that far behind. None of us did. Back up top, my team had done their job and done it well. Bodies lined the stairs and lawn, and yet, through the silence, Codfish and Largemouth continued to bicker. I slowly shook my head back in response. Damn. The team's fire support. Despite his inexperience, his ability to maintain rates of fire and ammo count, keep his head down and do it all under the mission set of a frogman. Deep in his stomach as he stopped, breath stolen as his mouth was agape. Their faces were filled with an animalistic rage. They crushed grass, branches, vaulted the stone fence, and yet they were completely silent and smiling. This was the unknown. A village on our home soil was being held hostage by something. Aimed at us, I asked to confirm. A radio check, now me, I asked. Those that reached the windows were taken down by Codfish and I, who with controlled groups of 2 and 3 rounds kept the swarm at bay. I thought. I sputtered to Codfish, grabbing onto him for support. God. We moved in. Mothers hugged daughters and sons, grandmothers, but little too. No males aside from Leicester and a couple of other officers. For whatever it's worth, stay safe, please. This wasn't an unusual mission for us. Codfish stepped forward. From his left, one of the village women shoved a candle stand into its face, stunning it. Shit. It all started with the arrival of that damned fog. It was strange to see. Tight shot groups firing off, dropping them left and right. He nodded, walking slowly over to Lester as I left the cellar silently. Cover the road, I'm going to. He tried to protest. His eyes, just like the ones at the church, just like those around the circle, they glowed, milky white as can be as he stared down at me emotionlessly. In my haze of pain, I didn't notice at first, however Codfish did, rising to his feet and gazing around. We did it, he muttered. A gust of wind blowing leaves past me as he laughed exhaustedly, and then quickly knelt beside me as he flipped me over. Shrapnel soared through the air, cutting through bark, leaves, and branches, destroying anything in its path. They knew that we were here since we stepped foot on the shore. A police patrol vehicle. Everybody stopped on a dime with not a sound between us. Anglerfish taking point, largemouth sat near the front in case we took any incoming fire. Codfish and I on either side. However, the ride got slower as we finally encountered the fog. It seemed almost as if one moment it was there and the next it was all over us. You could barely see the edges of the river and the green near it. So Angler had to crank way the hell. However, details were slim to none. He took aim at the church door with an MG3 and let loose. They were too late to help me, however, as I found myself being dragged down the hill. 2 cultists grabbed onto my combat shirt and pulled me down using gravity to aid them. Another salvo, another down. Damn, I guess this is my penance for my failure. That's what I noticed first. We had lost him during the fray and it seemed as if their raid hadn't been a total waste. His words were like molasses, slow and in uneven cadence. With much of the northern marshlands near the north coast experiencing this, however, this wasn't normal. My eyes followed his as I muttered, it never was. The revelation of this cult had him shaken as he left. We've dealt with all sorts of extremist cells and terrorism over 2 decades, but this was different, and if they could attempt something like this, what else were they capable of? 2 of my men are dead. Even from across the street I could see the blank face that he had as he stared wide-eyed at us. A knife found itself buried deep in his stomach as he stopped, breath stolen as his mouth was agape. Angler dropped lifelessly, his handgun bouncing off the ground as the weight of his knots forced his head to roll towards me. A pit in my stomach grew deeper with every single step we took into that hell. Their movements were unnatural in the way they just stood there opposing us, daring us. Largemouth and anglerfish had been listed as MIA, a fact that has burned me up inside to no end. The shots were sporadic and panicked, but even then I think the years of time that I spent honing my skills. I looked at Largemouth. Bird is on standby. Time to move, we need that destroyed. Our CO gave us a ramp brief right then and there in the dock. The butcher, Taylor, and all those in between and many of the lost officers all walked to the edge of the road and stopped. Codfish and Dangler fished to my right and left, with Largemouth covering our back. What's the play? Anglerfish asked. Living creatures had come out of hibernation, and there are some LZs that I've been to where these cicadas are so loud that we had to yell at each other in order to hear. And yet here, dead silence, all ambient sound muffled by whatever the hell this fog was made of, and the water was still. And then the horde, mounted at the edge of the marsh, rushed the chapel. I gazed over to Codfish, who gazed back. The rest of us quickly rushed to the church's stone wall. A leader amongst them emerged. The police chief. She won't stop here. IR lasers scanning through as Codfish and I cleared the open loft. It was empty. We should just lay into them, Largemouth suggested. Done what? Let them drag us into the swamp. As I knelt down beside the fallen officer, he coughed up blood, trying to roll over, but my hand snapped to his shoulder, keeping him pinned. Come on out. After a few seconds of silence, we were graced by the best sound all night. And I forgot who I was. Watching us, waiting. This was a lot to take in. You think your Harris can reach it? I asked, referencing the smaller radio mounted to his vest. Blunt force trauma, a rock or a brick? I tried fighting back, but I was winded and in no condition to fight, but damned I did. I stood up, a leap of faith that was returned when the officer dropped his hands. He then looked around anxious of the situation as he gestured us inside quickly. That exchange will not go unnoticed, although large mouths showed obvious signs of hesitation. I took the lead, stating, pick up your weapon. You're gonna need it. Leicester then grabbed his revolver and ushered us inside the church. We had finally found it. Your weapon, you're gonna need it. Lester then grabbed his revolver and ushered us inside the church. We had finally found it. Signs of life, or what was left anyways. Village inhabitants had taken cover behind pews and tables, dimly lit candles illuminating the central area as the windows had been covered with curtains and blankets. We had better firepower, but they had numbers, and we were far too close right now. And even with the safety of the church, they still swarmed the outside, only being held back by stone walls. Something's preventing it from igniting, so it just won't start. As he continued to dig deeper into the engine, triple-checking to make sure his assessment wasn't wrong. You feel the seconds, minutes, days roll by, but you don't at the same time. After a few seconds, he messaged 3 ed me over. From the corner of my vision through the white blue of my nods, I could see Largemouth's head snapping back again and again. I had my team form into a diamond. Largemouth was locked in place taking aim. Anglerfish said that he knew the way, so we followed him. Next is my designated marksman, Anglerfish. Frogmen teams are commonly used as a reconnaissance element to move ahead of a larger element, and act as an early warning or a forward guard. I felt like I had stabilized my situation only slightly, until the obsidian hands had returned. We arrived at a staging ground near the Yurjaby River. Wait, what did you mean by them? I quickly asked Leicester, just as he was about to speak. Anglerfish messaged 3 ed down. I flipped back onto my stomach and then took a knee. And then, we were only a few kilometers from the village when the engine suddenly died. 1 second the low hum of the propellers, the next it was off. Leicester said, blood beginning to pour out the side of his mouth as he turned to me. None of that. No info, no point of us being here, and we're all sitting dogs. I explained. We were now caught off guard. He finally answered. We are NATO's silent workhorse. Having followed larger nations and militaries into conflict zones such as Iraq, Afghanistan, into conflict zones such as Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, the Balkans, and to some places that aren't declassified. It's sickening to think about now, but I think I wanted to draw Nixie out, hoping that we could confirm if this was the anchor to destroy or not. These radios were lined with plastic and metal, preventing any sort of harm to the user. When the rainy season arrived, the mist that would come and go didn't leave, and as our home became more and more shrouded, people began to disappear. We are so glad to see you. I licked a large mouth. This seems to be the former. Impossibly so, I don't know how, but they hovered above his face for a moment and began to tear into him. His scream shook me into action as I hopped on our frequency. I got my answer when the snap of his suppressor echoed, firing a shot into my back. "We're with her now." "Sorry." Over the course of mere milliseconds, I contemplated what he meant. "Angler," I grumbled, trying my best not to yell despite everything in me wanting to. Whatever it was, they were wrong. However, my team was on edge already and the last thing that I needed to do was rile them up. A voice from the church messaged 3 out. "Wait, please. That we have ever failed, every god that has ever lived, we were going to." The walk out to the tarmac seemed a lot more tense than it normally had, and for reasons unknown to me, the insertion would occur at night time. Largemouth pulled off his helmet as I could see steam from his hot sweat entering the cool air. I forgot the pain. A life cut short. A family that was robbed or they were robbed from. I and my team set in as I ordered Codfish to inspect the radios, seeing if there was anything that we could work with. Snipers needed to be calm, comfortable in uncomfortable situations, but he seemed too much to the point of complacent. I wanted to message 3 out, yet a shape from my front caused me to halt my team. A follow-up rumble greater than anything they could have produced rocked the ground beneath us as, for the first time, wind entered the area around us. Codfish placed his arm over me, hoping to possibly shield me as we remained there, unsure of what was next. The church's priest greeted us, bowing his head. I nodded. That and when the batteries are locked in and the compartment is virtually sealed. Lining the edge of the puddle and the surface of the table were ruins of the elder Futhark. I don't know how to explain it. "Make your shots count," I yelled. "What about you?" I asked Anglerfish. We were in no position to burn ammo with no comms and then no chance for resupply, and so I messaged 3 hysterical screams and the tearing of flesh could be heard as I came face to face with them. Another child rounded the side of the table and buried a blade into his side, forcing him to drop to his knees. "Why'd you open fire?" I asked Leister, who rubbed his temples embarrassed. "I thought you were one of them," Leister said, cryptimessage 3Y, deepening the pit in my stomach as I asked. This was a lot to take in, some sort of legend from the folklore that was entrenched in our home as the soiled and dirt-wise. You didn't even confirm if it was firing at us. However, all of them looked deserted. The sounds of the forest returned. Codfish had given him a full sit rep, and although he was very scrutinizing of it, knew something was amiss when his report matched the findings of many of the villagers and the priest. They had no idea 2 firefights had occurred and only came in with a full force when the explosions of the grenades were detected by an infantry unit to the perimeter. I grabbed Lester by the arm and told him and his officer to get down there and keep the people safe, but not before saying, "Blow out every light you got here, we need it dark." Leister nodded, snapping into action as he and his men put out every single candle that they could. It was caught partially, stopped by the shoulder strap on my vest and my shirt, but damn if it didn't hurt. I screamed in agony, my left arm incapacitated as my right arm felt around, at my free holster. The cultist that had dragged me by the leg was hit directly in its neck, dropping down, as I fired at 2 more, catching them center of mass. Trying my best to ward them off, I wanted to say that I screamed, something akin to, "Damn you all." Good by 4. The center point of it was covered in a small puddle, no deeper than a couple of centimeters, and in the middle of that laid a large, crude stone table. What about our comms? We've got no way to alert Maine. It was short and to the point. I found out later the 7.62 NATO round punctured dang near the whole way through my plate. As we stepped foot on soil, we beached the craft and maneuvered forward in a wedge. It was rectangular, 4 doors with a license plate that read, AW65683, with a light bar on the top. Through the low light I could see it was white with jagged markings. And by every soul that we have ever failed, every god that has ever lived, we were going to. My gun went dry, I dropped a magazine, inserted another, and hit the release. I didn't count the dead. That is also probably one of the only pieces of information that you've ever received on us, as my home country's Naval Special Warfare Unit is shrouded in mystery for a good reason. We could have, Codfish said, being cut off by Largemouth, who stepped forward. A minute of silence passed. How many more has this mistaken? How much ammo do you have left? We are a recon element. Nothing that we could do could be done before we took out the bulk of the enemy force. No response from my designated marksman as he continued to stare out into the swamp, his rifle braced against the tree. I looked at Codfish, who gazed back, a mutual look of nervousness. A glow that seemed unnatural. It ate at the town, deteriorating it, taking the people and leaving ghosts behind. Whether naturally made or artificial still isn't known to me. The forest floor stretched down the slopes and merged with a strange granite brick-like surface that dipped and sunk at random points, probably due to age and erosion. I motioned for our headsets. I don't mean by my team, by something from beyond the veil. Predatory, malicious. Negative, road is empty. It's a swamp witch, Officer Leister muttered. Our home was being overrun by whatever the parasitic mist had brought, and every single step we took drew us further and further into this mobile kill box. He was close, and it cracked several of my ribs near my spine on impact. The force of it sent me straight into the ground, my rifle caught between me and the dirt, my nose smashing into the rail of my rifle as my face got a taste of soil and blood, and then my lung fought for lives as I coughed, heaving air as I tried to catch my breath. I thought that I was dying. I felt like I was dying. I didn't know what was happening. My gloves dug into the ground, flipping me onto my back. Through my night vision, partially smeared with dirt, I saw Angler flip up his nods. I reached for something on my vest, a push-to-talk device that connected our headsets to a team frequency. I walked over, attempting to make as little noise as possible. The man's head dipped back in relief. But nothing came, and I am partially wrong. Anglerfish walked almost the entire way with his weapon down. However, something changed. Some were written in a white paint-like mixture, mostly the ones that lined the outside of the puddle. However, the ones on the table, it was dried, no heat being given off, but from my long military career, I knew the sight of blood when I saw it. We are running desperately low, the old man said, tears welling up in his eyes. Last thing we wanted was all of our ammo burned through. The unit was green brick, only visible from the antenna that remained half extended through the top of his bag. Likely just a bad shot, lucky for us. Codfish immediately snapped at Largemouth. Oh, thank God. I contemplated the steps carefully when Anglerfish drew me from my thought. She's here. I looked back up as Nixie was fleeing back into the water, dragging the man into her makeshift puddle portal as his screams became smothered by the water. I thought it was the afterlife, floating weightless in half-consciousness. However, I was wrong. I messaged 3Ed out to Anglerfish again, and after a moment he seemed to shake his head, coming out of disassociation. I forgot who I was. He reached down and drew his pistol, the weapon shaking as he muttered under his breath when coming face to face with the children. And then they closed in. The obsidian arms emerged from the pool, grasping his shoulders as Nixie's head returned, and knowing that he was right next to the ritual site's epicenter, reached for the two M67 hand grenades mounted on his vest. We saw the patrol vehicle. UAVs were sent in to try and survey the area, only to find almost the entire area beyond the village was engulfed in a dense fog that a 30 million crown drone was unable to penetrate with neither thermal, IRS, or anything. With these situations seeming dire, SOCOM prepared a full maneuver and needed their best to be the tip of the spear. They won't stop here. The belt laid at his side, almost emptied, as he fired off, forcing the cultist back and cutting down more and more thralls. I felt a hand at my carry handle causing me to flail my good arm, only to see that it was Codfish. Maybe she gave them something. We need not fight. I checked my watch. What the? Codfish's words trailed off when he opened up the radio. However, nothing in then. Last thing I heard as I drifted off was him shouting into the headset. God. Them. He requested, no demanded with his dying breath. So, what the hell is it? Nixie. The silence. I took this chance to flip up my nods. Not fully clear, but we could see much farther than we could even at the church. It could be a scared civilian. There was no knowledge of enemy combatants that we could rationalize and then distance ourselves from. And just then, the worst message 3 out I could ever imagine reached my ears. This soldier. A woman yelled from beneath the cellar. Engage. Engage. I screamed. The roads were definitely experiencing the effects of the rainy season after several weeks of no maintenance, as a layer of mud and gravel kicked the surface. The houses around us were dark, filled with shadows and pitch-black voids, a mix of old-style stone and hay and newer brick houses with wooden tiles. I must see to our fallen.